Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Elements of Judicial Temperament, Part 3, Emotional Regulation and Judicial Behavior. Thank you for joining us. Please keep your microphone on mute and your camera turned off. Note that this webinar is being recorded. The recording will be released on our website within about 1 week of this event. If you are attending for CLE credit, please sign in via the link provided in the chat box. The CLE sign-in will be open for 1 week following this event. Finally, we encourage you to use the chat function to ask questions at any time. I will forward all Q&A related questions to Judge Fogel. I will now turn it over to our Director of Judicial Education, Denise Neary.
Thanks so much, Natalie, for this and all you did to bring today's program together. My Berkeley Judicial Institute colleagues and I are so grateful to have all of you here today. And whether this is your first program with us or one of several, welcome. We recognize you have limited time and we're grateful that you're spending some of that important time with us. Today's program is part 3 of a series of programs that Berkeley Judicial Institute has done on judicial temperament, this one focusing on emotional regulation and judicial behavior. And before we start, forgive a brief advertisement because we want you not just to participate in this program, but become official members of the Berkeley Judicial Institute family, where our goal is to create better bridges between the judicial world and the academic world, this program being immodestly one great example of that. But I encourage you too to check out the Berkeley Judicial Institute's website. There you can find recordings of past programs, and I would bet after you watch this, you'll want to go back, if you've not before, to see the other programs. You can join our mailing list. You can follow us on Twitter. I know, so many things you can do with those screens we've been spending so much time with the past couple months. So now on to today's discussion, and I'm so grateful that we're going to have this discussion. It'll be moderated by Berkeley Judicial Institute's Executive Director, Judge Jeremy Fogel. Judge Fogel has served on both the state and federal courts in California and served as director of the Federal Judicial Center, which is the education and research arm of the federal courts from 2011 to 2018. He'll be joined by Professor Terry Maroney of Vanderbilt Law School. Professor Maroney is professor of medicine, health, and society, and her research largely links emotions and the law. I have to give a shout out to my colleague, Elizabeth Lambert at the Federal Judicial Center. My direct connection to Professor Maroney and Judge Fogel's wonderful energy and synergy is through the mid-career programs for district court judges that my former colleague Liz Lambert developed. And so I'm especially grateful to that and to her, and so grateful that this wonderful team continues the good work they started in large part at the Federal Judicial Center. That might not be true, but I'm sticking with that story. So Judge Fogel, let's go ahead. What will we do today?
Thanks so much, Denise. Thanks for the introduction. Hello, everyone. It's good to be with you. I'm very glad that you're here to join us. This is, as Denise said, the third part of a series that Terry Maroney and I are doing, and it reflects work that she's been doing for a very long time, and it reflects work that she and I have been doing together actually for quite a long time as well. The idea is to understand what makes judges go from the inside. I mean, we know all of the conventional cultural thoughts about judges. They analyze the law, they apply facts to the law, they think in linear and logical ways. But any of the judges who are watching us, who are with us today, know that judging is much more complex than that. That judging has an affective side, it has an emotional side. That being a judge requires things of us as people. And one of the things that judges universally say is that one of the most challenging things about being a good judge, about being a judge that you feel good about being, is maintaining a good judicial temperament, a good judicial demeanor. And this is an area that Professor Maroney and I have been focused on for some time. And she wrote, I think, a really groundbreaking law review article earlier this year trying to define what judicial temperament actually is. It's one of those things that people talk about a lot. Everybody says, well, that judge has a good judicial temperament, that judge has a bad judicial temperament. But there really hasn't been a careful scholarly analysis of what the elements of judicial temperament are. And the work that Professor Maroney has done attempts to present that. And I think she's done a wonderful job of pulling together the literature from psychology, from clinical psychology, and from what we know about judges, and coming up with a theory, with a paradigm of judicial temperament. And the first two parts of this three-part conversation really focused on what that theory is. And we'll spend some time just refreshing people's recollection as to what the difference is between temperament and demeanor, and how they relate to each other, and what the elements of judicial temperament are. And then we'll move on to something that I know almost all of the judges who were with us the first two sessions expressed desire for, which is, what can we do about it? Once we understand what's baked in, what's permanent or less likely to be changeable in our temperament, what can we do to have the best judicial demeanor that we're capable of having? What are some practical steps that we can take along the way? And that's where emotion regulation comes in, and all of the other work that Professor Maroney has been doing over the years, and that we've tried to do in the mid-career programs that Denise talked about, and the other teaching that we've done together. So Terry, I'm going to turn to you, and you can start us off with the brief refresher about temperament, and then we'll move right into how you can optimize your judicial demeanor.
Absolutely, will do. I'm going to start sharing my screen, and while I'm going through the mechanics of that, I just want to say again, thank you to the Berkeley Judicial Institute for having me. And hopefully, okay, can somebody give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen? All right, thank you, Judge. So, and thank you, Natalie, great. Okay, so let's get right into it. And as Judge Fogel just said, we're going to start with a very brief refresher. And again, I do urge those of you who would like to dive deeper into the construct of judicial temperament to go back and check out our first programs as well. But Judge Fogel, as you just said, I was motivated to do this project because it had this element of cracking a mystery, right? I've put up 3 quotes from 3 eminent people, one including yourself. I believe this was from your confirmation hearing, actually, way back in the day. And all 3 of these quotes from very different people reflect the exact same idea, which is that temperament is a thing, and temperament really matters, right? It's the key to everything else. It affects how you judge cases. But then, as Jeffrey Rosen is saying, it's also very hard to define. So what is the key? What is the lock? And what is it that we are unlocking? So this is the bottom line here, which is my fundamental position is that judicial temperament is a psychological construct. We're trying to say something about, as you just said, Judge, what makes the judge tick? Who is the judge on the inside? And it's only part of what we look for in a judge. Obviously, we also want people who are intelligent, who have legal training, who have good democratic values, etc. But it's a really important part of what we want, and it's separable. It's something different than their intellect, something different from their training, something different from their ideology. Here in a nutshell is what I think it is. It's a relatively stable set of personal traits, and we're going to dive deep into that part, that in dialectic with judicial environments and demands, meaning in context, right? The judge in context in their job, drive behaviors, and those behaviors affect how justice is delivered and how justice is received. So this is sort of like the diamond of it, and each facet means something. So we're going to start, I don't know, you can't really break apart a diamond. We're going to look with one of those little thingies at each facet of this particular compressed idea. So looking a little bit more at the facets, here's a very rough and ready template of how I think judicial temperament works. The first thing we start with is that judges, like all human beings, have traits. We have deep-seated traits. And by the time that we're adults, particularly by the time we're in middle age, which is the age most people are when they are eligible to become a judge, things have stabilized quite a bit, right? And it means that we walk through the world with relatively stable patterns of how we act in the world and how we react to the world. So, drawing again from the psychology of temperament, the most important parts of a judge's temperament are they fall onto various domains. One is the degree of negative emotionality. And again, this doesn't mean individual instances of being, say, angry. This is trait level habitual patterns of getting angry or getting sad or being satisfied, etc. So one thing we need to look at is where is this judge in the domain of negative emotionality, which could be anger, contempt, frustration, fear, anxiety. Where is this judge in the domain of positive emotionality, a propensity to feel pleasure, satisfaction, joy, excitement? Where is this judge on the domain of kindness, meaning tending to approach the world with an attitude of compassion, capacity for empathy? I think of this as agape, or the general disposition to have loving kindness towards the world. And then finally, and apropos of what we're going to dive into today, where is this judge in the domain of emotion regulation? Again, as a matter of habit, as a matter of pattern, how flexible is this particular judge in shaping his or her emotions to meet her goals in the situation, and how much range does she have in those regulatory capacities? Don't worry, we're coming back to that. So this is kind of what the judge brings to the bench. The next thing is what the bench brings to the judge, right? Take that person with those traits, put that person in a work environment. And we all know, you all know certainly better than I do, that judging is a very heterogeneous profession, right? There's traffic court judges in Detroit, and then there are federal appellate judges in Boston, right? There's everything in between. There are people who handle wildly different types of dockets. They are located in different places. Some of their offices and chambers are beautiful, some are not. Some of them are fast-paced, some of them are contemplative. Some have to do with broken families, some have to do with broken contracts, right? There's pretty much every sort kind of variation in this job that we might want to imagine. So you take the person, you take the environment, you put them together, and they generate behaviors. Right now, keep in mind, these are not the only things that generate behaviors, right? In a judge's workday, lots of other things generate behaviors, but temperament is one of the things that in interaction with environment will generate behaviors. And the behaviors that we're most concerned about are, as Judge Fogel said, demeanor. How do you come across? How do you treat people? How do you talk? How do you write? What's your tone? What are your interpersonal interactions like? Are they conflictual or are they smooth? Health related actions. Do you take care of yourself in the course of doing this job? So all the things that are not sort of, do you know how to read a statute? Do you, what is your judicial philosophy as you construe case law? Not those things, but pretty much everything else about you as a human interacting with the demands of your job. So this is the basic idea: person, environment, dialectic, boom, behaviors. Now
And
there's
if I could
two.
just interject here, you could imagine, and you have it right there, the goodness of fit.
Yes, say something about that.
You can just imagine somebody who might be great, at doing a heavy felony docket,
Yeah.
where you put that person in family court and they explode within about 24 hours, right? I
I was,
mean,
I was like, is he going to say 20 minutes or an or a
yeah,
year,
yeah.
right? Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So
And it
yeah,
is all about that goodness of fit, right? And so I'm glad that both our minds went there
yeah,
simultaneously.
yeah.
So one of the really important insights from this developmental psychology is there's really no such thing as a purely good or bad temperament. It's in context. How good or how bad is the fit with the environmental demands put on the person, right? So you might have a temperament that perfectly suits you for one kind of judging and terribly suits you for the next, right? And this is an important thing to get in our heads, because to the extent we've thought about judicial temperament at all, we tend to think of it as a thing that makes you a good judge or not a good judge. And as we'll see, it's a complicated thing. It's not a unitary entity. But judging isn't a unitary entity either. So it's actually a very complex, it's like the world's most complex Lego system, right? Where it's not, you got to find the right slots and the right holes. Does that make sense, Judge?
Yeah, it does. And I think there probably are extremes to what we're saying, where there might be people whose temperament is such that they just really aren't suited to do much of any kind of
Yeah,
judging.
there's no judging Lego that will ever fit
Right,
their
because they
temperament.
just don't deal with conflict well, or they don't deal
Correct.
with people well, or they are always impatient, or they're always angry. So you have to be aware of that. And there's other people whose temperament is such they have the flexibility and the ability to regulate that we're going to talk about in a little bit, that they
Yep.
could do almost anything.
Correct. Yeah, I call those the air balls and the slam dunks, right?
Yeah,
There's
yeah,
some,
yeah.
there's it's again, if we're thinking of it as a very complicated Lego game, the number of Legos and the size of your playing field are those are not infinite, right? There are some restrictions on this. There are some people whose temperament will suit them for virtually no sort of judging. There are people whose temperament will suit them to most forms of judging, though they'll have better fit with some than others. And most people, of course, are a complicated mix in the middle. And then the game again is to figure out what is the judicial work environment that is the best fit with your temperament. And then the second part of that is how can you grow your envelope of possibility? So here's one important idea from the psychology here is goodness of fit. Another one is this idea of an envelope of possibility. That one, people's temperaments are complicated, right? They have all these parts to them: negative emotionality domain, positive, kindness, emotion regulation. But also, they're not completely fixed. Even when you are solidly in middle age, like I am, you can still grow and you can still change. We should never expect people to become their opposite. Like sometimes there's this idea that the office will change the judge in some way. And maybe, yes, they were sort of constantly, tearing things down and abusing people and being horrible when they were a law firm partner, but the solemnity of the judicial office will change them. Not really, right? Like we are kind of, by the time you're as old as we are, it's a little bit, yes, what you see is what you get. However, there is room for growth. There is room for growth. No matter what your temperament, there's always going to be some room for growth. So I am going to share a quote I shared last time just because I love it so much. Jerome Kagan is sort of the father of all modern temperament research, a psychologist at Harvard. And his analogy is this: if we think of water as being your temperament, he says condensed water vapor can, depending on local conditions, form a white billowy cloud, a mackerel sky, a dense ground fog, but it cannot become an asteroid. Right. So when we are talking today about increasing your emotion regulation skill, which is part of your temperament, we're not saying your condensed water vapor, let's make you an asteroid. But we are saying, okay, you're condensed water vapor. And it would be better if you were a mackerel sky instead of a dense ground fog, because it's prettier and it obscures our vision less, right? So let's see, within your envelope of possibility, let's go for mackerel sky, right? But we're never going for asteroid, right? So for the remainder of this workshop, we are going to focus squarely on this. What can all judges do within your envelope of possibility to move your needle within the domain of emotion regulation? Judge, I'm going to pause here to see if you have any questions.
I think that the only other thing I would add is that it's good to be as aware as you can be of what your temperament is, because your temperament is baked in. And so if you're a person who's prone to being depressed or discouraged or negative, it's important to know that about yourself. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't be a judge. It doesn't mean that there aren't things that you can do about that. But it's just important to be aware of that, so that as you try to regulate your emotional responses to things, you say, well, this is what I'm coming with. This is the hand I was dealt. And similarly with if you have the sort of the upbeat temperament, if you're the kind of person who's irrepressible, that's great. Sometimes it's very functional, and sometimes it actually isn't. Sometimes you need to be able to empathize with people who are not where you are, and who are really struggling. So I think part of the value of distinguishing temperament from behavior, from demeanor, is to say that self-awareness is a really good thing here. It's one of the sort of the foundational attributes that you want to have as you go about regulating your emotions.
Absolutely. So that, in fact, is exactly the right place to start. So you can't regulate your emotions if you don't know what emotions you're having, right? So just as Judge Fogel has just said, we need to start with a concept called emotional granularity. And granularity is the idea of being able to get very, very specific with yourself about what the range and depth and nuances of your emotional experiences in your life as a judge are. And that takes some work, especially as most people in our culture have been acculturated to think, well, the judge is not supposed to really have an emotional life when you're at work. And so why the heck would I try to notice them, right? But it's actually incredibly important. So there are three important components to the sort of emotional granularity that will equip you to be able to start regulating your emotions. First, you have to notice them. Then you have to be able to name them. Then you have to try to understand them. Now, obviously, we could spend several weeks just talking about that. But I just want to put it out there that the first thing is to, if you're having a moment where, say, you've told an attorney not to make a particular argument and they start making that argument, you're going to have some feels about that, right? It's just going to happen. But what are they? And a very low granularity response to a question like that would be like, well, it was upsetting. That doesn't have a lot of content to it. Upsetting just means it was disorienting or sort of unsettling in some way. Well, were you mad? Were you disappointed? Were you frightened that something bad was about to happen and you weren't going to be able to stop it? Were you disgusted because this person does this all the time and you're so done with it? Like, what was it exactly? What exactly did you feel? Being able to name it and say, I think in this instance, I was just disappointed because I thought he'd do better. And then you want to understand it, which is, again, I'm disappointed because I thought this person was better than that. And now I see they weren't. Or I'm angry because I know this person is better than that. And I don't understand why he would disobey me, or whatever it is, right? So getting to that level where you get to fairly practiced with noticing what you're feeling, being able to name what you're feeling, and understanding why you're feeling what you're feeling is a very, very good thing, even if the feelings themselves don't feel good, like being sad or angry or disappointed.
And
So again, we
yeah,
talked for a long time about this, but go
no,
ahead.
I just would add one thing to that, which is that what you just modeled was sort of being granular about what happened in the courtroom, and a lot of times the emotions that we feel on the bench are actually reflective of things that happen somewhere else at another
Sure.
point in time, right? So I've always liked the idea, ever since the word bandwidth entered my vocabulary. I really like the idea of bandwidth. That that sometimes when you're on the bench and you have a difficult situation, you don't have a lot of bandwidth, and maybe you don't have a lot of bandwidth because you didn't get a lot of sleep, or there were things going on at home that pulled at your attention, or maybe you just had an argument with one of your family members where they were insisting on something and you wanted them to stop, and you couldn't be the judge and tell them to stop, and then here you are, facing that situation in the courtroom. So I think, this idea of granularity really encompasses everything that we're feeling and experiencing when we have these emotions.
Absolutely. And it's really important. One of the great things about granularity is, again, it's kind of the difference between a climbing wall, like at a gym, and just a flat wall. If you can notice and name and understand, then you've got something to work with. There's something to grab onto. Otherwise, it's just, this is where we get this idea that emotions are just kind of overwhelming and they just happen to you, as if we weren't agents, right? So it gives you something that you can grab onto, something you can work with and be like, oh, I'm actually not mad at this lawyer. Maybe I'm a little bit mad at this lawyer, but mostly I'm really, really, really mad at, whatever happened before. That's really important information, and that gives you something you can work with, right? Now, sometimes again, the emotions are just bad. Like, you're angry at this lawyer because he really does know better and he really is trying to get your goat because he really is trying to, sort of some instrumental reason wants you to blow your top. That's just hard, right? Nobody likes that. And you don't have to like it. The point of granularity isn't crack the code of your emotions so you'll feel fine about all of them, because you won't, right? But even when the emotions themselves are unpleasant, it not only gives you something to work with, but it has all sorts of other benefits that studies are showing now, which is people who are more granular actually show less aggressive behavior. Again, probably because their emotions just don't feel so out of control to them, right? People literally live longer and healthier lives. People drink less when they're stressed, which I'm just saying it's a big deal in our profession. And getting to where we're going to spend the rest of this time, people have better emotion regulation skills. And again, the link is very obvious to the skills. If you don't know what emotions you're having, it's very hard to know how to manage them in context, right? So this is really the place to start. So what I want to do now is just go back to the concept of emotion regulation. And remember, we're all talking about within, if we're all condensed water vapor, like, how can we be more of some version of condensed water vapor, not trying to become asteroids? But emotion regulation is basically any attempt that we as human beings make to try to affect what we feel, when we feel it, and how we express our feelings. We do this all the time. Sometimes we're aware we're doing it. This will age me, but for some reason, I always think of that scene in the old Mary Tyler Moore show where she's trying not to laugh at the funeral of Chuckles the clown, right? That's emotion. That's a failed attempt at emotion regulation, right? But we do this all the time in less visible ways where we try to, because we have goals and because we're in situations that demand certain things of us, to feel this, not that, to feel this at a different time, to express our feelings in a different way, depending on what's required of us, right? This is a lot of, Judge used the word bandwidth. A lot of our mental bandwidth is actually taken up fairly frequently by efforts to do this, so we may not always notice it. And the goal is not to tamp down one's feelings, right? The goal is to have flexible, goal-driven deployment of diverse regulatory strategies. You want to have a deep bench of stuff that you know how to do. And we're going to dive into the components of that bench.
And if I may, Terry, I just want to really emphasize that point you just made, because,
Yep.
I've known, hard to believe, but I've known probably several thousand judges in my career. And this strategy of just stuffing stuff down is very, very widespread. I mean, the idea is, just about every judge knows. I mean, there are some notable exceptions, but just about every judge knows you shouldn't yell at people, you shouldn't blow up, you shouldn't, you shouldn't act in an unprofessional way. I mean, it happens, but everybody kind of knows that it's not optimal. But
Right.
but about the only strategy a lot of people know is to just try to stuff it down.
Yeah.
And one of the real points of your work and the work we've done together is that doesn't work. It might work for that particular instance, but it doesn't work as a long-term strategy.
Correct. Again, what we really need is we need a very deep bench. So people who are very high in dispositional emotion regulation skill have lots of things they know how to do, and they can pop them out in any given situation. And people who are very low in this domain as a temperamental matter tend to have one or two go-tos, and they roll them out no matter what the situation, and they whether or not they work, right? And so part of it is like just expanding your bench and expanding your concept of what it is you're trying to achieve with your emotion regulation. And different strategies have different costs and benefits, right? So let's go straight to the strategy actually that you were just alluding to, Judge Fogel, which is suppression and denial. So suppression and denial are, I think we all probably know what they are, but this really is a psychological concept, as well as sort of a pop psych one. But this is basically the state in which we represent to ourselves and to other people that we don't feel what we feel, right? There is a judge, for example, who, an appellate opinion, they actually quoted from the record where he was sort of chastising the parties for what he thought were emotional appeals. And he was like, I don't have any emotions. I'm just here. I'm like an iceberg, but there's no heating. Right now, that may not have been a statement of what he actually believed about himself. That may have been an instrumental statement saying just like, knock it off, guys. But what we're talking about is the people who really do believe that, like, I'm not moved one way or the other. That's not a part of what's going on with me. So this is it's funny, Judge, that you just used the term stuff it. So this is actually a quote from one of the many judges I've worked with and interviewed over the years that I think encapsulate this idea, which is, asked basically how he regulates various things. He sort of said, no, I think mostly I just try to stuff it, right? Another judge that I spoke to not long ago said, I think we in my court, we have this machismo, like, we're just supposed to toughen it out and we're supposed to take it. And, if anything is upsetting to you, you're supposed to kind of like shrug it off, laugh it off and go, haha, I'm tough, right? So that's kind of the mentality that we're talking about here. And this is a very common thing to do. I'm not trying to malign it, as it's understandable that we all do this and some of us do this a lot. Unfortunately, it's extraordinarily counterproductive. So I'm going to say a few of the ways that in which it's counterproductive, and then Judge Fogel, I'd love to hear your thoughts. So the first way is that it actually literally doesn't work. Like if the idea is I want to diminish my emotional experience by being like, I'm not having an emotional experience, it literally does not do that. It's kind of, I don't know, game, set, point a little bit for me there, but it also actively does bad things. Like it can result in what's called ironic rebound, which means that it may, this idea of you stuff something down here, it's going to pop up there, right? And it can actually increase the emotional intensity and salience of whatever it was you were suppressing at a later time. And it also kind of creates a little bit of a reaction without a cause, right? So this is where misdirection can come from. Judge Fogel, you actually gave a good example of misdirection earlier by saying, I'm really upset at what happened before I got on the bench, but now somebody's given me a target. And so I'm going to hurl all of my repressed anger from time A at time B, right?
I'm going to reach back to a memory from, I think, more than 40 years ago, when I was a relatively new lawyer, actually very new lawyer. And I went to court to get a continuance of a trial because my partner was unavailable. And the judge had just dealt with about 5 or 6 lawyers, none of whom were very impressive in terms of how they were conducting themselves professionally, and was getting more and more and more frustrated and trying to stuff it. And then it was my turn, and he just about bit my head off.
Yeah.
And I had done nothing.
Right.
But,
sometimes the person who gets their head bit off has done something, but they haven't done something that's
well, I asked for a continuance,
level, right? Yeah.
which required something of him,
right.
But it was, I had good cause, it was just,
you were here.
Yeah. I mean, it was, I think most lawyers have had that experience. Most judges have had that experience where you sometimes, suffer for other people's sins.
Oh yeah. I've had it when I was a litigator. I mean, it's, and again, this is not like a cardinal sin. Like everybody's going to do this sometimes. It's not like a tripwire, like now you were in the hole of a bad temperament, but it's not optimal, right? It's if you were to say, what are my goals for myself as a judge? That's not on your list. It's just not, right? So we're all about increasing capacity, not to make people magic, but to improve your ability to act in the way that you would like to act most consistently, right? So you don't want this. You just don't want it, right? Another bad thing it does is it's actually so effortful for human beings to suppress our emotional experiences that it chomps away a lot, again, of your bandwidth. It's called cognitive load. And so studies where people are instructed to suppress emotion, then they're given like logic games and things like that, you can actually see that when a person is suppressing an emotional experience, their memories for other things that were going on while they were doing that is not as good, right? Because they're spending part of their brain space doing something else. Their cognitive capacity, even simple arithmetic, not as good. A lot of judgment errors. If you give people slightly trick questions, they'll go for like the intuitive wrong answer instead of the more thoughtful correct ones. It's basically like, your cognitive resources are a precious commodity, and this is chomping away at them. And it's not doing what you want it to do. And it's kind of kicking the ball down the road for you to slam it on somebody else's foot, right? So on top of all that, if you do this all the time, which is the biggest danger for people very low in this domain as a temperamental matter, like again, everyone does this sometimes. But in terms of temperament, if suppression and denial are your go-to strategy, the thing that you always roll out or often roll out, it can harden and so you're no longer condensed water vapor with changing into anything else, right? This is just kind of where you're at. And it can harden into this repressive coping style that can have think of people who are just kind of like curmudgeonly, crotchety, just like this is their steady state. You don't want to be that person, right? And I'm sure they didn't either when they started out, but sometimes this is where people end up. So this
Well,
is
and there are also physical effects, right? I mean,
yes. Oh yeah.
it's not, you mentioned the impaired memory, cognition, and judgment, but uh, high blood pressure, chemical
Heart
dependency,
disease, yeah.
you know, needing to have a couple of drinks every night when you get home. I mean, it's just, it really can affect the quality of life over the span of a career.
Correct. So this is literally the only strategy I'm putting that big red X on top of. This is something that one should try to scrub from one's repertoire. But you can't just get rid of it with nothing else, right? So you have to replace it with something else. So let's talk about, we're going to go through a progression of things that are sort of increasingly on average more functional. So
And let me
here's
just say at this point, we've already gotten some questions, and I just want to let the people who submitted them know that we will get to them, but I
yep.
think we'll do it after we kind of walk through these strategies.
Yeah, we're on track to have tons of time, fortunately, for questions and answers. So here's something that can, again, expand your bench of regulatory strategies. Sometimes it's very hard to change yourself or your reaction, but you can change something about the situation that's causing your reaction or that's contributing to your reaction. So this is basically steps you can take to alter some aspect of your situation, the events that are actually happening, the timing of them, the space in which they're happening. So I'll give one example, and then Judge Fogel, you and I can talk about a few more, but literally taking a break is one sort of highly, highly functional situation modification. So this is a judge who is describing what I believe this was what she was doing, what she would do when she was describing to me a very, very, very tense courtroom moment. And something about that dynamic needed to be broken, right? And this is, we all know that feeling of like, when you feel like I no longer feel like I have choices, right? Like that pressure of a very tense moment, and you are afraid that your reaction's not going to be what you want it to be. So, she said when that happened, I took a break, and she said, I'm not afraid of taking a break. I'll take a break, I'll vent, I'll cry, or I'll just sit for a couple minutes. I'll just gather myself, and then I'll go back out. So we can talk about some other forms of situation modification, but let me just tell you what's great about this type of strategy, which is it breaks the dynamic. It gives you a sense of agency and control, right? Instead of feeling like at the mercy of whatever it is that's pushing you to a place you don't want to be. It conserves your internal resources, right? So instead of, let's again imagine a very tense courtroom moment, instead of like pouring massive amounts of internal resources into your reaction and controlling your face and keeping your voice from shaking right then and there, you just leave, you let those internal resources restore themselves, and you go back, and then you can act in the way you want, right? And I was just say, I really advise judges, like, when you can change something about the situation in a way that is consistent with you doing your job, do that, give yourself a break, sometimes literally, but often figuratively. The job is hard, and if there are things you can change them, like, so some other things judges have told me about that fit into this category are saying, I can't do 3 sentencings in a row. I just can't do it. Right. I have to break up my calendar. And yes, it's a pain in the neck for the clerk's office, and we had to go through a rescheduling order, but it's not good for anybody. Now I do 2 and I take a break, and then I'll maybe do 2 more, something like that. Or a judge who says, after a very bad experience taking some evidence in a child pornography case home and trying to work at it in his home office, and having a very, very negative reaction to that, and just saying, I don't want this stuff in my house. Like, I can't click into objective work mode with this horrible stuff while my kids are asleep in the next room. I can't do it. So now he doesn't take that stuff home. If that's the case that he has to work on, he stays in the office, right? So anything that you can change. So Judge Fogel, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think this is really important. I think, you know, I can almost hear some of my former state court colleagues saying, "We got to be realistic. I've got, I'm doing a family law and motion calendar, and I have 35 matters, or I don't have the time in the day to take those breaks. I have to get the work done. And if I took a break every time I got stimulated by something somebody did, I'd never get anything done. So,
but maybe you could take a break every 10th time,
well,
right? Like,
that's right.
something.
Exactly. You have to do you have to do what you can in the situation that you're in, and
Right.
it is going to vary depending on what that situation is. But I think the first thing is you need to realize that it's happening to you, and that it's not you and it's not them. It's the nature of the job that these kinds of things arise, and that another one of the words I've used a lot in talking about these things over the last few years, besides bandwidth, is having a baseline. And you sort of know what your baseline is, when you're okay, when you are the person that you want to be most of the time. Not some idealized notion of yourself, but not some train wreck either. This is the person you are going through life. And when something is happening to you that is causing you to be unable to do that, you can feel the tension building up. You can feel the anger building up. You can feel yourself getting very stressed. It's being able to spot those moments, to name them, as Terry was saying a little bit ago, and then to have a strategy for dealing with them. If you can be proactive, when I was on the district court, I certainly was able to schedule things when I wanted to. That's one of the things that district judges can do. Right. And so, and the example you gave was a good one. I would try not to do too many sentencings in a day if I could avoid them. Certainly ones that I knew were going to be emotional. Even civil motions, sometimes they were difficult cases with difficult dynamics between the parties and so on. I would make sure that I could regulate that. I didn't just let them pick dates. I said, no, I'm not going to put those 3 patent cases on the same day, because one of them will be enough, right? And try to work something out so that that would work. But I recognize that in busy courts, when there's a lot of work, there aren't, you don't have the luxury of being able to set things up exactly the way you want. But I think to the extent that you can move in that direction, it really does pay benefits. And I think the sense of control is a really important thing.
It is a big one. And that's why it's like, there's always something you can do. It may be very, very small. Like I've seen, for example, a number of judges who the small thing they do is they decorate their benches, right? So that at least if, during your workday that you're out on the bench, you can look down and see a nice picture of your family. I met a judge who has a tiny statuette that somebody gave her of an angel, and she just looks at it and thinks, better angels of my nature, better angels of my nature, right? Like you could have good music playing in your chambers, right? Like whatever it is you can control. Again, it's and they may sound like small things, but again, it's all about just giving you that sense of agency. And it's like, and sometimes it can be something about the built environment. So this is an example of a judge doing this for other people, but I still think it's a good one. A judge once realized in a very tense sort of awful double murder case where there was going to be, a defendant and then very large numbers of these two child victims' families, that it was just going to, the way the courtroom was laid out was going to require actually a lot of physical proximity at crucial moments between like when witnesses were getting up and we're going to have to kind of scoot past a defendant and who was accused of killing one of their children. Anyway, he said, and he was like, oh, we can cope with that or we can just change it. And so they just changed it. Like they rearranged the courtroom so that there would literally be no physical proximity. So again, sometimes you just have to break. And it's not like, oh, then that was the most fun trial ever, but it does mean this one particular recurrent predictable flashpoint was literally no longer there. So there may be things that judges can do for yourselves as well, that a recurrent stressor, you just find a way to get rid of it.
Yeah, the whole thread here is being proactive rather than reactive, right? I mean, you're not a passive victim of circumstance. You can think, well, what can I do to make this situation less challenging than it already is? I mean, the exact thing you talked about with the victims, that I did probate for a couple of years, and I had to do that all the time in will contests. I had to keep the kids who were fighting over the will apart, because it would cause those kinds of extracurricular activities sometimes.
Right. Right.
So
yeah, do something structurally for yourself, for others, to just, if there's a recurrent problem, maybe there doesn't have to be, right? I'm going to move us along so we do have plenty of time for the Q&A. This is something, again, that judges do all the time. That's a little bit more of a mixed bag, which is just controlling your external behaviors. So everyone will recognize this as, oh, I do this all the time, right? So choosing to either mask or to change some kind of sign of emotion in your face or voice or body. So you can think of this as sometimes you want to scowl, or laugh, but you'll put on a poker face. Sometimes you'll want to scowl, but you'll smile calmly instead. Sometimes you have to control your voice so your voice doesn't sound angry or sad. Or you have to control your body so you're not what's the word? You're not broadcasting, basically, like, you're not going like this or like, oh my God, or
rolling your eyes.
Things you might want to do, right?
Yeah.
So here's an example of a judge who told me about the extreme effort she had to put in one case not to cry. And I asked her why. And she said, you can't cry. And then she was like, well, and she specifically said, as a woman, I think if I did cry, any authority I had would go out the window, which may or may not be true. Probably she's right though, right? So sometimes you have no choice. You have to do these things, right? It's very crucial to demeanor, to courtroom management, right? You don't want to broadcast a lot of what's going on internally to people who are watching you like a hawk. And you want to make sure that you're modeling the kind of behavior you want other people in the courtroom to be exhibiting, et cetera. So this is kind of you got to do it pretty regularly. It's a little problematic though, for two reasons. One, it doesn't actually change your emotion. You can be very good poker face. You're still feeling what you're feeling. So it's kind of, just don't expect too much of it. It'll do your instrumental work of keeping people from seeing what you're feeling, but it's not going to change what you're feeling. And unfortunately, it's effortful as well. So it also creates cognitive load, not as much as suppression, but some. So the advice I give judges is do it purposely, meaning I know why I'm doing this. Like I don't poker face every second of the day because that's what a judge looks like. I'm doing it because in this particular instance, I need these people not to see what I'm feeling, right? Or I need to change the courtroom environment, which means I need to smile even though I feel like calling somebody an idiot, right? So use it when it's important, and otherwise don't.
And
right?
And to that point, and I know we're gonna go there. I mean, there's the situation from time to time where it actually is appropriate
Yeah.
to show emotion, and don't be afraid to do it if you're in that situation. And I'll give an example of one where
please.
I did, and I thought it was okay. It was an immigration case. I used to do a lot of those when I was on the district court, and frankly, a lot of them were just very, very sad.
Yeah.
They were cases where, I mean, there's status offenses. There were people who had returned after being deported, and if you do that, it's a felony. And then, if you pick up a a DUI or a petty theft or something, and then the immigration authorities find you, then you get charged with illegal reentry after deportation, and that's a serious crime.
Mhm.
So I was in these situations where I was about to send people to prison, and the allocutions, they would tell me why they had come over the border, and some of them, they were just these really pathetic stories. I mean, that they literally had come from situations that were so bad that they
Yeah.
knew that they probably would get caught. They knew they would probably go to prison. They knew they would probably get deported again, and they did it anyway. So, and in one of them, the guy had his mom came, and he had come to see his mom because his mom was sick. That was his explanation for why he re-entered. And my judgment was that that probably is what happened. I mean, I didn't have any reason to doubt it. And the mom came, and she spoke to me during the sentencing hearing. And she's, I don't know any other way to describe her. She was just this very, small woman from a rural part of Mexico, who had been living in the United States. And so she told me the story, and I couldn't not tell her. I said, I'm really sorry
Yeah.
that this happened, and I'm really sorry that your son's going away, and I'm sorry that your life has been so hard. And I don't know if I teared up or not, but I know there was a lot of emotion when I spoke to her.
Yeah.
And I thought that that was just fine,
Mhm.
because I think it conveyed a sense of caring and a sense of justice.
Mhm.
And I also explained I don't have a lot of options here. I mean, this is illegal, and your son knew it was illegal, and he pled guilty to it, and so it's like, it's just, but there was a place for compassion.
Right.
And I don't think judges should be afraid to show that by choice after thinking it through carefully. And I think it can be very satisfying when one does that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great example. And if I can zoom out and get meta for a second, it really touches on both of the essential components of judicial temperament, which is is the content of one's habitual emotionality, right? The positive emotions, the negative emotions, and included in the positive emotions is kindness, right? So what you're describing is an emotional experience that for you, and I think I can say this because I know you, is habitual. You habitually will feel kind feelings, compassion, generosity towards people in trouble. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to extend a helping behavior, right? Like canceling the order of deportation, because you can't, right? There's a hard constraint on that. You can't. But then going to the regulation part is you have these feelings. What are you going to do with them, right? And a person high in regulation skill will say, is this an opportunity where it's actually useful for me to express these feelings of compassion, or is it not, right? And sometimes it'll be one, sometimes it's the other. But in that instance, it was helpful. It doesn't change the outcome. It doesn't open you to any particular criticism that's going to come back to haunt you. It recognizes the humanity of the people in the room. It probably made you feel better because you feel like at least I was authentic, and at least I felt like myself in this situation. It gave you an opportunity to explain something, which makes people feel better about the courts, right? So, but there are other instances in which you may feel a ton of compassion for somebody, but there are other constraints of why it's really not an appropriate thing to express in that moment, right? So a low regulation, high kindness person would just say all of it all the time, right? But that's a great example of a combination of two highly valued temperamental traits: high kindness and high regulatory skill. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it certainly does. And I think the reason I felt good about it was it was a conscious choice.
Right. It's
I
not, you just kind of blubbered it out, right?
no, and I
Exactly.
think it's important for judges to maintain dignity and if not emotional distance, at least not to just kind of go around wearing their hearts on their sleeves. I think that creates other problems. But I think there are certainly times when expressing compassion is a
Yeah.
positive
Or
thing.
anger, sometimes expressing anger, 100% appropriate, or disappointment, or whatever it is, right? Our conversation is, again, a little bit less about the content of the emotion and but about the way in which it's regulated so that it's situation appropriate, it advances an important goal, right? So that's
Well,
a great
and this is
example.
a good example, and I'm going to actually, it's one of the questions we got, and I hope the questioner doesn't mind, I'm going to adapt it a little bit so that it's not, it doesn't identify anyone. But, if you have a bad lawyer who
Right,
just does a really bad job
right.
and kind of persists in the same bad behavior over and over again, it's really acting in an unprofessional way. And you value professionalism and you want lawyers to live up to the
Yeah,
the ethical and professional values. At some point it might be useful to say something, and then
absolutely.
and then the question is, well, what do you say?
Right.
And in
Are
this
you gonna bite
example,
your
which
head
I'm
off
making
or
some effort to disguise here, I mean,
right.
you could write an opinion in which you point out, without slamming anybody personally, you just point out, that they failed in every possible aspect of the professional task that they had, and this is why they lost the case. It's like that I think there's places for judges to be genuine, to be real, without
Yeah.
exhibiting poor temperament.
Right. And I think, again, a lot of it is about choices. And again, this is the thing about when you have high granularity about what you're feeling and why you're feeling it, and you have high regulation, which is, and here are all the 10 things I could do with that, then that gives you the time and the space to pick one and say, in this instance, I do need to have like a personal talking to with this lawyer, but it's not going to help to bite his head off. But it might help to be like, I'm just so disappointed, and you just can't do this. So what are we going to do about it? Or it could be something else, right? Which brings us actually to our next strategy, which is thinking about cognitive change. So you'll see how this ties in just a second to that excellent question. So one of the most productive emotion regulation strategies that a judge can invest in and practice is this one. And it means changing your thoughts about someone or something in order to change your feelings about that someone or something. Because all emotions, again, are underlain by thoughts. That's what it means to understand your emotions. What's it about, right? So, funnily enough, the quote that I picked here is from one of my judges who said he used to just yell at lawyers all the time, and his level of practice was so high. Everyone he knew's levels practice was so high. He just couldn't believe, how bad people's practice was. And then he said, one day I just came to realize that some lawyers are just not that good. They just don't get it. So what is the point of yelling at them? So that reflects an underlying thought, which is, if you can unpack the previous set of thoughts that would have you yell at them, is they're capable of doing better. They've chosen not to do better. And if I yell at them, that will prompt them to do better, right? And he suddenly realized he was just thinking in the wrong way. He's like, they can't, they're not, and it won't, right? And that doesn't mean you just give up, but now you're like, okay, now what do I do? Now I'm not mad at them because, they're just not doing it, even though I tell them to. But you may just feel frustrated or disappointed or sad, that law schools, are churning out people who don't know how to practice or whatever it is. But you're no longer a hammer going after a nail that's just not ever going to respond, right? So if you think in your own life as a judge about what would that look like for you, here are the kind of questions you might ask yourself. So if you have an emotional reaction, you might say, okay, what's it about, right? What else could be true, right? In this instance, it's like, are they insubordinate? Are they obstinate, or are they just unqualified, right? Like, what are the other, here's a story I'm telling myself. What are the other stories in the world that could be true? Can I change the story I am telling myself? Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't, but it would be good to figure it out if you could, right? And then you think, well, what kind of broader perspectives might help? What different perspectives might help? If I were looking at this from a different point of view, how might I see it? Right. And I'm just giving this one example of the incompetent lawyer, but you can think of this in, pretty much anything that is upsetting. And sometimes it's just broad perspective taking. Like, there's no amount of looking at horrible child pornography evidence that's going to make you feel okay about that, because it's not okay, right? So you're not going to tell yourself a story of like, oh, that's not really a child, or oh, that's not really, don't tell yourself a crazy story, a fictional story, but you might just say, this is a horrible thing that happens in the world, and how lucky am I that I get to be part of the solution, and somebody's got to carry this burden, and it's, this is what I signed up for, and of course I don't like it, but that's why I do this. Like, again, any kind of story you can tell yourself that lifts you out of the stuck narrative that you're in. So Judge Fogel, your thoughts?
Well, I mean, my first thought when I think about this particular problem set is uh, cases that involve a lot of discretion.
Mm-hmm.
So it could be like family law, or probate, or juvenile dependency, where you're looking into families and intimate interactions between people. And I did those calendars for a long time when I was on the state court, and I had reactions. I'd see people, I said, God, I mean, how could she put up with that, or how could he put up with that, or how could they treat their kids that way?
Right.
And I would find myself having those reactions all the time, and there was no way to get through the day if I stayed stuck there, because that wasn't my job. And my job was to listen to the people and try to figure out what's going on, try to be helpful if a legal decision needed to be made, then to make it. But I think the incoming of emotion was very constant, and I think people who've done that kind of work know that. And I think it's true in sentencing as well. That if you don't have a guideline or a plea agreement that dictates what the sentence is going to be, well, should I give this person a chance or not? So much of the way we take stuff in is influenced by who we are and what our life experience has been. So this idea of reframing it
Right.
is really pretty critical, I think, not only to maintaining a good demeanor, but also to doing a better job of judging the case, so not getting tangled up in the
Yeah.
in the emotions.
Yeah. And also just your longevity as a
Mhm.
judge. I mean, if you, really think like, wow, 99% of the people in the world are just so profoundly messed up, you're going to have a hard time withstanding that, right? So that's, as I'm putting myself in your shoes, and now I'm inserting where I come from and what I think about. But if I were trying to invest in different narratives in the kind of scenarios that you've talked about, one thing I can imagine saying to myself, like a little mantra, is I think I know a lot about these people, but I don't, right? I think I know everything about their family, but I don't, right? I'm seeing the worst part and only the worst part, and I know there's more. And then you know what I mean? I would just give myself little perspective things and say, and then I would say, and my job is to help them navigate this worst part with the least damage. That's the thing I can do. I can't do anything else, and so I'm just going to focus on that, right? And
Yeah, and I think I know that especially early in my career, I was annoyed a lot.
mm-hmm,
I was annoyed by
mm-hmm,
bad lawyers. I was
sure,
annoyed by defendants who didn't keep their promises. I was annoyed by all kinds of things like that. And in a state court with a busy docket, I mean, I was seeing that multiple times per hour, let alone.
like, why can't you read the plain text of a
Yeah,
rule, or why
yeah,
don't you bring in this piece of
yeah.
paper
And I think,
yeah,
and at some point I had to figure out how I was going to manage that annoyance.
yeah,
That not that I wasn't still annoyed, but I mean, it just,
right,
I had to figure out how to recognize, okay, I'm annoyed. This is why I'm annoyed. Being annoyed at this person is not going to accomplish anything. So, except in a rare instance, and we can talk about that. But I mean, if I sort of purposefully decide I'm going to show my annoyance to somebody, that's different than doing it reactively.
right,
But I had to kind of reframe it and
right.
figure out a way to get through the day without doing that.
Right. And one way you can reframe it is to be like, yeah, there are a lot of really annoying parts of this job.
Mhm.
Like even that is actually reframing because again,
Yeah,
it sort of just goes meta on it for a moment. And like every
right,
job has some really annoying parts and this
right.
this is certainly one of this one. And then you can almost like laugh about it in a way, which gets us, I think, to our last strategy, which I want to make sure that we have the remainder of the time for questions, which is one of the best ways you can do this and introduce this set of questions like, what am I reacting to? What's it about? How could I think about it differently? Is there another perspective? Is there a way I can just frame this in a way that will make, even if I can't change it, make me able to live with it? This last strategy I want to highlight is very helpful with that, which is social sharing, which literally means just talking to other people, saying something, showing them something, writing something, anything that communicates between you and another human being something about your emotional experience. And I couldn't pick just one quote here, so I put in three little ones. So you can bounce things off your colleagues, you can talk to your family, you can rant and rail to your clerks, right? Like you have a few safe audiences, as long as again you're not, disclosing things that you're prohibited to disclose, but your own emotions belong to you, right? And you can disclose them within your safe zones to people who can help you figure out how to cope with them, right? So the first thing that this does is it diminishes your isolation. And not all judges feel isolated, but a whole lot of you do. And a whole lot of you who do feel isolated find that distressing. Um, Again, this is not a universal judicial experience, but it's a common one. And especially if you're in a culture, a court culture where it's like, well, we don't talk about stuff like that. Well, why not? Right? You could be the change maker in that culture. And if not, what about your family? What about your clerk family? What about your deputies, right? Anybody that you can talk to will make you feel less alone with these thoughts and feelings, right? It increases your granularity because when you have to describe your feelings to somebody, you have to notice, name, and understand it, right? Like the act of talking about it gets you to granularity because otherwise there's your no words are coming out of your mouth except feel bad, right? So when you can articulate it, that gets you granular. And then the people you talk to can help you figure out how to think about it, right? Like, well, did you consider, was the person really being insubordinate or are they just incompetent? Did that person really do this or did they do that? Or could you think about it in this other way, right? And the things that you can't change, like the annoyances, they can just be like, yeah, that's awful, I'm so sorry, right? And then you're like, yeah, it is. So you can actually just get a little bit of acceptance of some of the things you can't change, right? And then finally, like this can really build relationships that can be very sustaining for you. And here I'm thinking specifically with colleagues. And it can also repair relationships. This comes up a lot with appellate judges I talk to that, these historical acrimonies and conflicts can build up and calcify in an appellate court in a very unique way. And then you get to the point where you literally can't talk to each other. And you don't ever want to be in that place. And so getting in the habit of being able to pick up the phone or being able to see the person or being able to actually talk something out, even if you kind of hit a brick wall on their end, it can go a long way towards repairing some kind of functional relationship. So I want to say
Just,
two things and then
yeah,
we're going to stop. Go
yeah.
ahead.
Let me just embellish on this just a tad. I think one of the things I observed was that you know sometimes judges will they'll go out to lunch or they'll socialize, and that there is some of this taking place, but a lot of it is more like stylized venting. It's the same complaints over and over again. There's not. I think the key word in this strategy is sharing.
Right.
That it's being genuine when you talk about the experience, and I think it's easy sometimes to have it slide into you go out and complain about the same lawyers all the time, or you
Right. We don't ever want to turn into like a clique or a dog pack.
yeah
Right.
the
That's
thing
not productive.
no the thing that makes it work is really talking to the other person, with the other person. I mean, I had a very close colleague on the district court where the thing I treasured so much about the relationship was that I could talk to him about anything and he could talk to me about anything. And so, I would have a hard case, and I could just go say, this case is really giving me a hard time, and then he would ask me, so, well, what's hard about it? And I would say, and I would get listened to well, so there's kind of a mutuality that is important, and a genuineness that's part of this. But I think if you have that, then it's incredibly powerful.
Yeah, I
I
think
think
so.
this is one of the very best strategies, really.
Yeah, I think everybody needs a judge buddy, preferably more than one, but
Mhm.
everyone needs at least one, and not everyone has one, unfortunately. So it would be great to find one.
Yeah.
Let's close this out, and then let's have, I promise so much time for questions. And of course,
Yeah. Well,
um,
we've addressed some of them, but and there's one I really do want to get to, because I think it's one that a lot of the judges who are listening to us are probably have
thinking.
dealt with or will deal
Well,
with.
let me close this out then, and then let's get to that. So I just
Yeah.
want to float, even though we're not going to have time to talk about it here, that what I've given to you are kind of the whistle stop tour of emotion regulation strategies. There's lots and lots and lots of them. These are just kind of the big ticket items, and ones that I think are particularly important for judges to think about and invest in. But I think judges would also be well served if you just think about what are some kind of Uber strategies for helping you grow skills like these and other skills too. So I just want to put two out there. One is mindfulness, which is very near and dear to Judge Fogel's heart. I think mindfulness is a very promising strategy because it doesn't have any particular content to it. It's really about the process. It's about the process of noticing, naming, understanding, and giving yourself time and space to make decisions. So it's not itself a strategy, but I think it's a tool for expanding your capacity for instantiating strategies in your actual daily life. And then the other thing I want to say, in large part to destigmatize it, is professional help, right? And again, there can be a culture in judging where one does not seek professional help, or one doesn't admit to seeking professional help. And I really think this is very important to destigmatize. These are complicated things, like especially if you're a person who has perhaps some disadvantageous temperamental traits, like maybe high fearfulness or high anger. Again, these are not cardinal sins. These are human attributes that many people share, but they're hard to shake and they're hard to work with, right? So there are people who do this for a living and they're good at it, right? So this could be something that people might want to think seriously about pursuing. The last thing I want to say here again is, like, remember that emotion regulation isn't becoming magic. It's becoming a better version of what you come equipped with already. And all of us can do that, right? This is a really important part of every single judge's temperament, right? And so the questions I would say are most important for judges to walk away with is to ask yourself honestly, and ask the people who know you, who really know you. When we're talking about emotion regulation, we're talking about negative and positive emotionality and kindness. What are your strengths and weaknesses, right? And how can you grow within your envelope of possibility? So I'm going to leave those questions there for everyone to ponder. And then now back to you, Judge Fogel.
Yeah, no, and I think it's really important that you summed up, and we only have time for one question, but I really want to make sure we get to it, because I think it's kind of in a way, it puts all of this in a sort of a sober context, but an important context. The question had to do with when you have somebody in the courtroom who's really combative,
Yeah.
somebody who may be delusional, somebody who absolutely cannot regulate their own emotions. They
Right.
may be dealing with a mental disorder of some kind. And that's something that trial level judges deal with. I mean,
Absolutely.
and so how do you respond to that situation? What are some ways you can regulate your own response to that situation? And I'll say a couple things, and then Terry, whatever you want to add, I really be very interested in how it fits into your framework. But I think the thing, and I used to represent these folks. I mean, that was what I did as a lawyer. So it's something I will remember all of my life. I think the biggest problem is that we're afraid. When you see somebody acting like that it's so out of line with what our expectations are. You know, the situation we think we can control or we can manage or at least understand, you know, in the courtroom. And then somebody comes in and they absolutely don't follow any of the rules. They don't act the way people are supposed to act. They're exhibiting intensity of emotion at levels that we're not used to. I think that the most common reaction to somebody who's doing that is to be scared. And it's not even necessarily that you're conscious that you're scared. You just
Right.
get.
A lot of times when we're angry at people,
Yeah.
we're actually scared, and we're angry at
Yeah.
being scared, so we act angry. That's
Exactly. And I guess so my answer to the question is you need to know that. You know, that what allowed me to have those people, that group of people as clients when I was representing them, was I had to learn not to be afraid of them. Or at least how to modulate my fear of them. There were people I was afraid of, even when they were sitting in the chair in my office. But it was, if I couldn't get past that, then we were not going to have a relationship. And so I think the thing with self-represented people who are out of control, even with lawyers who are out of control, be aware of your own fear, your own response to that and what it's doing to you, and then figure out how to respond to it in a way that is not locked into that. You know, it can be calm, can be firm, but be calm, be kind, be compassionate. And if that doesn't work at some point, you know, you have to say, okay, we're done. And, you know, if you don't stop, I'm going to have to ask the deputy to escort you out. But I mean, you know, so you have to set the limits. But the first thing you can do, and the thing you have control over, is your own emotional response.
That's right. That's right. And I think, you know, I wish there were just a, you know, a plug and play where we could say, oh, do this, not that. And of course there isn't, but I think there are, as you said, Judge, I think there are a few things that will almost uniformly help. And they mostly have to do, again, with the noticing, naming, and understanding. Noticing that you're afraid, noticing if part of what's upsetting to you is a challenge to your authority. And that's where you can engage a little cognitive change, right? You can tell yourself a story that's probably true, which is that this is an extremely ill or broken person. This is not a duel, right? I'm not here to win. I won't win. The battle against this person's mental illness or brokenness is not one I can win. Therefore, I need to not engage in it. And the point of this is not for me to come out looking like I'm a man or a woman who knows how to rule my courtroom, right? Because I do think that that's the combat. It's very hard not to engage in somebody who's very combative, right? But that non-engagement is very crucial. And part of the way that you can do that is, again, by noticing your thoughts and deliberately investing in thoughts that will help you cope better, right? I'm here to get X, Y, or Z done. This person is broken in ways I can't fix and with which I should not try to engage. I'm not being tested here. I'm not being graded. If people have thoughts about how well or how poorly I did my job here today, I'm not concerned about them. I'm only concerned about my own self-evaluation of how I dealt with this very difficult situation. And again, that's easier to do with a little time and space than it is to do in the moment, right? So, but if you know you're going to be in that situation, invest in those thoughts beforehand, write them down, like put them on your bench so you can remind themselves of them. And if you're in that situation, do anything you possibly can to buy yourself even 10 seconds to reorient your thoughts, right? Like, oh, I'm in this situation. Here's what I need to remember, right? So these things really can help because they sort of just take you out of the combat and remind you of who you are in the situation and what you can and can't do.
Yeah.
And that will help you.
Absolutely. And just to underscore what Terry said in terms of sort of larger strategies, both mindfulness practices and wellness, taking care of yourself, are ways to get more bandwidth. I mean, and the bandwidth allows you to make the choices in a more present way. A lot of courts now, and I will say it's been fascinating. BJI gets requests from courts, core organizations, judges all over the country to talk about how do we get more bandwidth. And a lot of it is coming from COVID and, having to run court in a very, very stressful environment. But I mean, people are feeling stress, and they're really trying to find ways to cope. So we are beyond time, and I'm sorry we didn't get to a couple of the questions that were submitted. But Terry, that was wonderful, and we were talking before the program. This is a talk I've heard Terry give for like about 8 years now, and it just keeps getting better. And it's just wonderful you could share it with everyone. And
Well,
I'd like
thank you.
to thank our audience for being with us. And as I do to close all of our programs, stay safe and stay healthy.